I have now been on YouTube for over a year. I may have posted my first video back in March of 2023, but I started recording and planning out 6 table builds back in November 2022. Well, plan is a strong word for me. It's more like being hopelessly optimistic, in over my head, or up a creek without a paddle. In this compilation video, I'm not just going to slap together my old videos, as that would bring no value to you. And if you checked out my old videos, let's just say, better than I used to be. I hope you enjoy. Do you like free stuff? What about money? Then I'd like to introduce you to Pallet Wood. Last year I found myself with some free pallet wood, and I also found myself watching a Morley video about selling pallet wood tables for money. And I like money. So I went to work getting the pallet wood ready to be actually usable, which starts with creating a clean surface on 3 sides of each of the boards. In this case, 41 of them. I don't have a jointer anymore or some type of straight cutting jig, but a track saw can also work. Then I turned to the table saw to break the boards down to my desired width. In total, I broke down wood for 3 pallets, which took about 5 hours to do. Next, we needed to figure out how we wanted to glue these boards up, as I want to use all the pallet wood, including any broken pieces, which was only slightly annoying to do, as I need to be careful where I place the glue. Another thing about this wood, we're actually going to use this for 2 tables. More on that shortly. I went ahead and used my hand plane to knock off any dry glue, apparently for fun, as I proceeded to run the boards through my thickness planer to get one flat top. This whole process produced 13 boards from the original 41 pallet boards. Now we're left with a choice. Do we proceed with table 1 or table 2? Unfortunately, this isn't really a pick your own adventure game, unless you pick table 2, because we're going with table 2. I'm going to use 5 of the 13 boards for table 2, which I like to call the oddly shaped table. Semi-pro tip. If you're not using biscuits, dowels, or dominoes, just take your time with the glue up. Gluing up 2 boards at a time is much easier to manage than trying to do it all at once. Not that I've done that before. When making an epoxy mold, I like to use melamine, because that's what I saw Blacktail Studio do, and that's where I learned epoxy from. But a tip that I've learned from 4 Eyes Furniture is always wrap your mold in tuck tape, rather than using mold release, unless you want this to happen. Then I used a bunch of caulking and these MDF screws. I really like MDF screws when I'm using melamine. It allows me to not have to pre-drill any holes, and everything holds together very nicely. I use deep pour epoxy for this table, mixed with some black dye. It's funny that I keep calling this a table, because at this point in the build, I was still thinking about making this a bench. Mix and scrape the bucket and mix a bunch more. You do not want to have to deal with epoxy that has not fully cured. And then pour and pray for no leaks. During the 3-day curing process, the epoxy shrunk a little bit. So I just mixed up some tabletop epoxy to fix the problem. It was a colder day in the shop, so we went ahead and used a heat gun to warm up the surface of the epoxy. In theory, this should help the thicker tabletop epoxy flow better and self-level. A few days later, we could go ahead and see if the epoxy actually wanted to release from the mold. Like I said before, always use tape for your mold. It makes working with epoxy so much easier. Added bonus, you're able to reuse the mold. I have a flattening jig, but I also wanted to try something I've never done before, which is flatten this on my CNC. things did not get off to a great start. But I was able to figure it out in the end. In the end, this learning moment cost me an additional 1/16 of an inch from my original desired thickness of the table. At this point in the project, I had decided that I was going to make a table, and I purchased these legs for it. Because of the unique design of the legs, I decided that this table should have a unique design as well. I don't know how to describe the shape of this table. It's not a circle, it's not quite a rectangle, maybe a full figured rhombus. Either way, I'm going to let the CNC handle cutting out the shape of the table and cutting out some recess for the legs. You could easily just use a jigsaw to cut this table shape, and a handheld router to recess the area for the legs. For tables that I make, I like to have a nice round over or bevel at the bottom of the table. In my shop, the router is the tool that I have the most fear and respect for. For this table, I bought a 60-degree bevel bit, which is the craziest looking router bit I've ever used. The fact that I'm able just to buy this router bit, install it, is crazy. I do not know how I am being trusted with this level of danger. But I have learned if you take multiple shallow passes, you're most likely going to be okay. I also added the same bevel on the top of the table to kind of match the design of the legs. It kind of gave it this flying saucer look. So how many times do you finish a tabletop before you're happy with it? The answer is definitely more than one. Well, at least for me. The finish I'm going to be using today is polyurethane.
Round 1.
I have never used an oil-based finish before. Did I read the instructions? No. I did use a not a dollar no more store brush to apply the poly, and to no one's surprise, it did not look good. So I went ahead and sanded off the finish and started over.
Round 2.
I went ahead and made some wipe-on poly from, well, poly and mineral spirits to remove the brush from the equation. And it worked great until it didn't. More on that in a moment. The last thing I had to do was rub down the top with a brown paper bag, per the internet, and I was done. But then I noticed these spots all over the surface of the table. So you know what that means. Sanding and restarting the finish.
Round 3.
I first started by wiping on the poly again, but then I saw a video by the Wood Whisperer where he used a foam brush to apply the wipe on poly, and then I switched to that for the next 3 coats, as it allowed me to apply a thicker coat of wipe on poly. I learned a lot from my first 2 failures. When sanding between coats, I ran into some problems when using 400 grit sandpaper on the epoxy, as it left too many scratches. So I switched to only using the sandpaper on the wood, and then came back with a white pad over the entire surface. I also skipped the whole brown paper bag rub down, as it didn't go well last time. The last thing I needed to do was go ahead and mark and drill holes for the threaded insert. Some people call pallet wood furniture a scam. And it is, in a way, if you don't know what you're getting yourself into. But if you've ever milled up rough sawn lumber before, you know there's a trade-off for prepared boards versus preparing the wood yourself. So pallet wood is definitely not free. At a minimum, it's going to cost your time, which I would argue is more valuable than money. But if you don't have any money to spend on wood, but do have time to spare, it's not a bad deal. This whole process produced 13 boards, Now we're met with a choice. Do we continue with table 1 or table 2? Hopefully you chose table 1 because that's the one we're going with. I'm only going to need 6 out of the 13 boards for table 1, which I'm calling the banana leaf table. The inspiration for this table came from Modern Builds. Link to his video in the description. I'm making this table for the wife who was born and raised in Guatemala, which is one of the largest exporting countries of bananas in the world, per Google. So naturally, she wanted me to make her a banana leaf inspired table. I did not originally plan to make this table wide like Modern Builds table. The shape of this table was not at all dictated by the fact that I cut the boards down wrong, glued them up at the wrong angle. No, it's definitely not because of that. You know how when you start something, you normally suck at it? Like woodworking, marriage, remembering to record yourself? Okay, maybe that's just me. Building good habits takes time. Which is why I don't have footage of me breaking down the pallets, much footage of me gluing the boards together, or any footage of me using my track saw to cut down the panels to be able to glue them up into one. But I do have footage of me gluing the panels together in a poorly lit area of my shop. So that's something. This was me back in January of 2023. And I was definitely a different person back then. Mainly dumber. Next, I could go ahead and forget to record myself cutting down the leaf panel. Bear with me, it gets better. Here's a screenshot of how I cut the panel down with my track saw. Those greenish lines, those are the lines I cut at. Disregard the blue leaf. The wife did not like that design. I did remember to get a last shot of me cutting the end of the table, so that makes up for it, right? No? Okay, moving on. The wife had the idea of using just tape as the mold for this table. Will this work? As we're going to cut down the panel later, so that's what we did. But just in case it leaked, we built a mold around the tape mold. I went ahead and mixed up some deep pour epoxy and tinted it to a leafy green. This is the first time I've used a color other than black in epoxy. And you may say, black's not a color. And yes, I know. Whatever color pine is considered, it pairs very well with green. While the epoxy cures, I need to make some legs for the table. I wanted to make sure I utilized all of the pallet wood I had, so I designed some templates for the legs to fit on these pallet runners, rails. I don't know what you call them, so I'm just going to call them runners. I went ahead and used a planer sled to get one side of the runners flat. And this should be of no surprise, as this is pallet wood, and it definitely ain't flat, square, or clean. It's the poor man's rough sawn lumber. Originally, my plan was to use the router to cut out the final shapes of the templates. If you're saying to yourself, that sounds like a terrible idea, one moment please, we'll get there. I didn't take into account grain direction, and I didn't think of any safe way to actually hold on to the wood. In hindsight, making a router sled like this one from Woodwork Web would have been a good idea. It hurts present voiceover me to look at past me try to use the router with such a small piece of wood. Thankfully, I had a moment of kickback. That quickly made me realize this was a terrible idea, and I abandoned it before I hurt myself. I searched through YouTube to find a quick and safe way to get these templates cut out, and I found a great video from Inspired Woodcraft, link in the description. It's great for a number of reasons. It's a quick design, can be made out of scrap wood, and it makes the cut safer and a lot easier. This is an elf fence, and it only took 20 minutes of my life rather than my fingers, so sounds like a pretty sweet deal to me. I don't want any exposed joinery with these legs, which is why I didn't just screw and plug or pocket hole these legs together. This is my first time using dowels and a doweling jig for any furniture. A doweling jig definitely makes this process a lot smoother and not as stressful. I normally just buy metal legs as a time saver, but I want to expand my furniture making skills, and a project like this is the perfect time to try some new techniques. When it comes to clamping all these pieces together, it worked out, but in the future, I'll have a better plan on how to get better clamping pressure. But also, it worked, so I may not learn my lesson at all. Once the glue was dry, I did a quick sanding. Then I glued up the front and the back legs to prepare to cut everything to the final dimensions. I took advantage of the dog holes in my track saw table to be able to get repeatable cuts on all of the legs. Any part of the legs that were going to be exposed, I went ahead and gave a slight round over, as it will be a lot easier now than later. A slight round over or chamfer just makes a piece look more finished, and as an added bonus, makes me look like I actually know what I'm doing. Now I can go ahead and attach the right leg and the left leg to the center leg. I glued and screwed on one side of the leg, as you won't be able to see this when the other leg is attached. For the second side leg, I'm going to go ahead and use dowels. I use this other doweling jig that I have to be able to drill the hole straight. Then I use some dowel center pins and a flat surface to transfer the drill location to the second leg. The wife came up with the idea of using a brad point drill bit to align the doweling jig to ensure that we would drill a straight hole. And it worked perfectly. Now all I need to do is glue and clamp it up. I used a straw to clean up any glue squeeze out to avoid having to do any sanding later. Now that the epoxy is cured, I used a Sharpie and, at the direction of the wife, traced out a banana leaf. She definitely toned down my original design. But since this is for the wife, she gets to decide. I believe that's called compromising, at least in marriage. My brand of jigsaw is Ryobi, and it's blue, so that should tell you how old it is. And that's the excuse I give myself for why I suck at using it, and why there is so much deflection in the blade. But sometimes a lack of skill is just waiting for the right project. For me, it was this project. This was no longer poor tool skills. It was adding character. A little sanding, and then it's round over time. Next, I needed to go ahead and seal the exposed wood at the bottom of the table to prevent any possible warping. Two coats of epoxy should just about do. Before I could finish the tabletop, and once the bottom of the table was cured, I figured out the location I wanted the table legs. I wanted to use threaded inserts, but due to the angle of the table legs, it wasn't possible to do. So the table leg is just going to be attached with pocket hole screws. So I went ahead and drilled an oversized hole in the leg base for any possible wood movement in the future. For the top of the table, the wife wanted a high gloss look, so I went ahead and finished the table with tabletop epoxy. I love it when standard epoxy meets new epoxy. Seeing it go from a cloudy surface to a glass-like surface is very visually satisfying. While the tabletop was drying, curing, one of those, I could go ahead and add a few coats of Danish oil to the legs for a very simple finish, and then wipe any excess away. The wife claims to love this table, but I'm not sure. She also calls me the best husband in the world. She also puts up her Christmas tree way too early, so I don't know what to believe. For me, this project came out great, and it was nice to be able to try a bunch of new techniques that I've never done before. In the end, the table being slimmer was a happy accident, as it fit better in our bedroom. Also, the wife had me wet sand the top of the table to remove the high gloss, as she no longer cared for it. I bought this slab off of Facebook Marketplace, which can be risky. I was told that this is kiln dry, and it seems kiln dry, so I went ahead and rolled the dice, as I don't own a moisture meter. This was not the only gamble I was taking with this slab. It's a maple slab, but more than that, it's a spalted maple slab, which sounded pretty cool to me at the time. Semi-pro tip: when you're going to use a wood species that you've never used before, do a little research first. In this case, the problem wasn't so much the species, but fungi. If you don't know what spalting is, because I didn't know what spalting was, basically spalting is when you allow any type of wood to be exposed to a certain fungi and bacteria over a period of time. This process causes discoloration and produces dark lines or streaks in the wood grain, per Google. It also causes rot and decay. At this time in the project, I was unaware of that fact. Once I thought I was done removing all of the bark and the softwood, we call that foreshadowing, I could go ahead and then pretend like I'm a real woodworker and figure out the layout I wanted for the table. Then I could go ahead and cut the slab to rough size.
How about new?
This is my first time flattening a slab. I made my fancy flattening jig from some MDF and a very cheap flattening bit I bought off Amazon. I'm flattening this right now for two reasons. One, to make sure that it lays flat in the epoxy mold later, and two, to reduce the overall size to get it closer to its final thickness to avoid wasting any extra epoxy. Once I had the slab in the sunlight, I could see that there was still some dirt and bark that needed to be removed. At this point, I'm still unaware of the problems that are about to come my way. Remember how we talked about rot and decay? While flattening and sealing the slab, I realized I still had soft spots in the wood. We will address how I should have handled this later. At this point, I thought I was ready for epoxy, so I went ahead and built the mold. Tape your molds, caulk your molds, make sure everything's screwed tightly together, then wait 24 hours to let the caulking cure before you even think about pouring epoxy. Also, when possible, make your molds oversized. It makes it a lot easier to demold later. I don't know how to measure for how much epoxy I'm going to need, but I like to go with the wing it and keep a side project nearby approach. I carefully added a few drops of black dye.
Oh, wow. Okay, I don't know how to count that. What the? Do you usually pour that much?
And then mixed everything up. The moment before you pour epoxy is both exciting and nerve-wracking. Will the mold leak? Did I mix too much epoxy? Or not enough? Am I using decayed wood, and should I have sealed the wood better? Everything was going great.
I shouldn't have said that. I should not have said that.
But then we started noticing the rate in which the epoxy was being absorbed by the wood. If sealed properly, this wouldn't happen, but we didn't do that. The slab also started to float on us, so we added some weights to hold it down, as one clamp down block didn't work. Go figure. I did end up mixing up more epoxy than I needed, so I just went ahead and filled my additional mold. A few hours later, I started to notice that the epoxy was getting too hot, which, if you don't know, means that it will cure too fast and crack. When pouring deep pour epoxy, it's normally a good idea to use some fans to keep everything cool, just to be safe. I thought I was going to be okay because the shop at the time was in the mid-70s, but clearly, I was wrong. The fans helped to lower the temperature and avoid any cracks in the epoxy. Thankfully, that was one terrible mistake I avoided. Like I said before, an oversized mold makes it a lot easier to remove the epoxy.
Yep, it lost its suction, yep. There you go. There you go. There you go.
Now I can come back to the tool that is quickly becoming my nemesis, the flattening jig. The flattening jig makes a terrible mess of everything. I need to work on dust collection for this. I like the saying, I'm too poor to buy cheap. Unfortunately, like I said before, I bought a cheap flattening bit, which as you see left a lot of burn marks on the slab. And also left me with hours and hours of sanding, which took me. You'll also notice that not sealing the slab correctly led to a bunch of staining. But at this time, I was still hopeful that there would be an easy fix. For the shape of this table, I was inspired by 4-Ice furniture. I really like the rounded front and back of the table, as well as this angled profile that the table has. I made a few templates on my CNC to be able to create the rounded sections on the back and front of the table. At this point, I was still new to YouTube, so I forgot to actually record myself using the templates. But don't worry, I didn't forget to record the sanding. Then I could do my favorite part of any build. Router time. Then I could get back to sanding while water popping between grits. Unfortunately, sanding can lead into the second worst thing about making an epoxy table, exposing air bubbles, which leads to having to fill them. I'm pretty sure that not sealing the wood properly led to all the air bubbles that I have in this table. And unfortunately, all the sanding and flattening just ended up revealing more areas of soft wood. After watching many YouTube videos trying to figure out what to do with the softwood, I decided to use thin CA glue to act as a wood stabilizer. I went a little overboard with the CA glue, but it worked great as a fix until it didn't. So at this point, I thought I was almost done with the table, so I went ahead and figured out the location for the legs and drilled some holes for the threaded inserts, using my portable drill guide. I went ahead and cleaned up any dust with some mineral spirits, and I was ready for finish. My quick fix for the epoxy staining was to try to use Rubio Monocoat in the color charcoal. I don't know if you've ever tried to do a quick fix before in your life, but they don't always work out like you dream it up in your head. When wiping off the Rubio, I noticed some problems. The CA glue worked, but too well. It didn't actually allow the charcoal finish to actually penetrate, so the finish didn't actually show up in those areas. There was some softwood areas still, and in those areas, the finish did penetrate. Too much. I missed filling a bunch of air bubbles somehow, which was definitely frustrating.
Round 2.
I went ahead and sanded off the finish and got to work making the air bubble holes bigger so that way I could refill them with epoxy. Black epoxy is not fun to sand. It takes a lot of time and patience to get an even sanding pattern, but that might just be me. I then went through the process of refinishing the table and made it worse. So, I sanded through the CA glue I used before to stabilize the wood, creating these dirty, softwood looking areas. I took a break at this point to gather my thoughts and to do the actual research I should have done at the beginning of this build. I have a plan now. Step 1. Hate myself. And try to remove 1/16 of an inch of material to see if I can get rid of all the staining. When I was removing this extra material, it got me wondering, how deep did I drill those holes for the leg inserts? But then I went ahead and nicked the table and then also gouged the top. My cheap flattening bit continues to show signs of why it was so cheap. To avoid hours of sanding, it's worth it to pay more for a quality flattening bit. The nick in the table did cause me to set the roundover bit deeper than I originally wanted, but in the end I liked the final result, so finally a positive mistake. Can you guess what flattening and sanding this table will expose more of? If you said my time and extra money, you would be correct. And I still wasn't able to get all the staining out of the table, as the black epoxy penetrated too deeply into the wood. The first thing when working with this slab that I should have done that I'm doing now is stabilizing the wood. And I'm going to do this by using a deep pour epoxy, or also known as a slow cure epoxy. I spent the next 12 hours applying coats of epoxy to this table, trying to quench its thirst. Once the epoxy was cured, I could go ahead and sand the epoxy back to the wood surface. We will fast forward past this part and move right into filling a bunch of tiny little air bubbles. I really hope I don't ever make this mistake again in a future project. At this part in the project, I'm still paranoid that even after the epoxy, there's still going to be softwood. So I went ahead and applied a little bit of CA glue to the surface. This way, I get to do more sanding. I secretly think I hate myself. But I would also hate to refinish this table for a 4th time. Now I can go ahead and resand everything up to 240 grit, while water popping in between grits. But this time around, I went ahead and applied Rubio Monocoat in its clear coat Pure. We decided to do a second coat of Rubio Monocoat to help even out the sheen and to touch up any sanding patterns that we didn't like in the black epoxy. I'm really glad we did that second coat of Rubio. It really helped to even out the sheen, and the black epoxy areas looked much better. Looking at the finished table now versus how it previously looked, you'll definitely see why I refinished this table. All the character in the wood is now actually showing, and you can actually see those funky lines left by the fungus. It has been a long road to get to this point, but all the lessons I've learned along the way have been extremely annoying, but also in retrospect, priceless. This whole process will help me become the best version of me that I can be, and that's really all you can ask for sometimes. Let's go back in time. You probably noticed this offcut right here. And you were probably thinking to yourself,
What about second breakfast?
well, don't you worry, I got you covered. So here's the plan. Resaw the lumber, which I think is just a fancy way of saying cut it in half. Figure out how to do that without a bandsaw. Make a black river table. It's a pretty simple plan, but let's see if I can do it without messing anything up. To resaw, I'm going to use a pole saw. I mean, sort of. And now I have a great starting point for the pull saw. One hour later. Okay, so the pull saw is not working. I mean, it's working, but it's taking way too long. So I went ahead and switched to a reciprocator saw. The cut is not the prettiest, but it was definitely a lot faster. Thankfully for the moment, I was able to not hate myself and avoid using my flattening jig. Preparing to pour epoxy is pretty much always the same. Clean the slab, seal the wood, and make a mold that you wrap in tape. If you recall, this is spalted maple. Unfortunately, I was building this table at the same time I was building the main slab table. So I made a lot of the same mistakes that I made with that table. So I'm new to Texas, but I've learned a few things since being here. When it's a very windy day, you shouldn't say things like this.
Let's hope we don't lose power. Oh, okay.
This is not the time to lose power. Where's my brush? It's back. Thankfully, I was able to finish the pour before losing power again later on that day. The epoxy mixture had a lot of air bubbles in it, so I made sure to brush the slab to try to remove any air bubbles from clinging to the sides, and use my heat gun to pop any other bubbles. Removing the epoxy from the mold is easily top 5 for me in most enjoyable steps of making these tables. We put this table face down in the mold with the idea that we were going to build up the thickness of the table with epoxy. I know a lot of people think that sanding is the worst part of woodworking, but they're wrong. Milling lumber is. Or in my case, flattening an epoxy slab. I fully understand why some people pay somebody else to do this. It is horrible. I unfortunately can't justify that extra cost, or I would be paying somebody to do this. For the design of this table, I'm again finding my inspiration from Four Eyes Furniture. I think Four Eyes has a great eye for design, and I really like all of his work. Well, most of it. When I saw his video on a piece of scrap wood, and then I later purchased these legs, I knew I needed this table to have 2 round edges with matching roundovers. At this point in the project is when I realized the table was too thin. So I'm adding plywood to the back of the table to create some extra thickness. Sometimes you get lucky when you're just winging it. Let me explain. I'm only adding the plywood filler here because I don't have enough epoxy to get the desired thickness that I want. At this point, I only have tabletop epoxy left, so I had to do 2 pours over the course of 3 days. We also just made a tape mold for this table to utilize all the epoxy we could. The plywood later will give me a surface to be able to drill into for threaded inserts. I don't like the idea of drilling into epoxy for threaded inserts. So this was a nice happy accident. But then my luck quickly runs out, as now I have to use my flattening jig. It's that time in the project to ask a very important question. Have you ever seen a router get down? Go router, go router, go. Go router, go router, go. The round over on this table is pulling double duty. 1, it looks amazing, and 2, it's going to disguise the slab's lack of thickness. So I'm a coward. No, that's not the right word. I'm an overly cautious person. Sometimes. Because this is spalted maple, aka decayed and rotted wood, I went through the process of adding deep pour epoxy to stabilize any softwood. And then CA glue, just in case. One thing I didn't have to deal with on this table was air bubbles. This is one small, yet giant victory. And not having to fill air bubbles is like waking up an hour early and realizing you can go back to sleep. Not having to fill air bubbles is like unwanted plans being canceled the day of. It's a wonderful feeling. Whenever I add threaded inserts, I like to add a little bit of CA glue. I don't know if this gives it any more strength, but I like to think it does. One of the best pieces of advice that I picked up from Blacktail is cover your table in painter's plastic between downtime. In theory, this should help prevent any warping or twisting in the table. I went ahead and added some black stain to the plywood before adding any finish to try to disguise the plywood. I ended up doing 3 coats of finish on this table. For the first 2 coats, I'm using Rubio Monocoat. After 48 hours, I went ahead and sanded the surface with a maroon pad to even out the sheen and to fix any issues with my sanding pattern. This step is a bit of a pain, like all sanding is, and normally takes a few hours to complete. But in the end, it's totally worth it. I ordered some of Blacktail Studios' Nano Finish to see how good it is and to give myself some more work to do. But more importantly, I want everything that I do to be of the highest quality, so if this helps, more power to it. Getting to this point is a major accomplishment for me. It takes a lot of work to make an epoxy table. This is the first slab I've ever worked with, probably shouldn't have chosen spalted maple, but I learned a lot, and now I'm a bit smarter. So the next table is going to be easy. I'm not a big fan of going to new places, but unfortunately I don't have a wood mill. So I got in my car and took a drive to a company named Wood here in Houston, Texas. I set out on this journey to get this walnut slab, as currently it was 50% off. I was also able to get another walnut slab for a future project and some ash. This is the first table that I was actually commissioned to make. And it took me 4 months to finish this table, 3 gallons of epoxy, and a few horrible mistakes. Inside this table, there's going to be a cutout of Texas. To reduce any waste, I went ahead and made a template. But as equally important, I'm trying to save as much of this slab as I can for future projects. I have a great plan for all the scrap wood I've been collecting. Like 12% of a plan for sure. The problem seems to be finding time. When cutting down the slab, I made sure to take multiple passes. In theory, this should help keep the saw blade from wearing out as fast and save me money. And I like saving money. I hate using my flattening jig, so I'm going to use my CNC to flatten this slab, as this slab is pretty twisty and warpy. Using shims and hot glue, I was able to level out the wood. That way I could remove the least amount of wood I needed to flatten the slab. Now I can go ahead and cut out the shape of Texas. This could easily be done with just a template and a router, or just a jigsaw if you got those skills. I was at the limit of how deep I could cut into this slab, so I decided to gamble and take a chance. Okay, that was a mistake. Being a good woodworker doesn't mean mistakes won't happen, but it's about overcoming those mistakes, especially when you're taking dumb risks. I carefully removed the surrounding wood, making sure to hurt myself along the way. And in case you were wondering, yes, I do own gloves. And now, I have a nice mess to clean up. So the client came over to see my progress and to finalize the table design before I started pouring epoxy. And he had a few additions he wanted me to make.
Like that right there then?
Yeah.
Pretty deep.
Yeah, that looks good. Oh yeah, that's perfect.
I'll tell you what this is at the end of the video, but go ahead and comment below with your guesses. Behind my hand, I was attempting to carve out a star. I warned the client, I am not a woodcarver, and he said, do your best. So that's what I did. After that unexpected request, I needed to fix the mistakes I made earlier, which meant I had to bring the slab back to the CNC. This wood is going to be covered in epoxy, so that means that I don't have to do too much sanding.
You serious?
When making an epoxy mold, always cover it in tape. Don't use mold release. This is the hill that I am willing to die on. So our plan is to do something that we've never done before. I know how this is going to turn out, but for you, let's just hope everything works out. We are going to do this epoxy pour in 2 phases. The first pour is going to be a black base. I've learned that it's better to mix epoxy with no color first, just to make sure part A and B actually mix correctly, as it's a lot harder to tell if something's wrong in jet black epoxy. I mixed up 3 gallons of epoxy as we're going to pour 2 projects at the same time.
Not a great plan.
When you're trying to do something for the first time, don't jump in head first. Try it with 1 project and not 2 at the same time, and then see what you do wrong. At this point, my confidence level was at an all-time high, and I thought, there's no way I can mess this up. I'm only pouring the epoxy about halfway, as I want some of the walnut to be revealed in this epoxy table. So I made sure not to flood one side of the mold with too much epoxy. Once we had the epoxy where we wanted it, we could go ahead and deal with the bubbles on the surface. Remember those holes I drilled earlier? I'm going to use a syringe to try to avoid any overspill when filling the holes. Try being the key word.
Oh, what a loser!
What I didn't account for or even realize what happened is upward bleeding of epoxy. Thankfully, in the end, it sanded off pretty easily, so mistake avoided. I left an epoxy void in the star I carved. That way I could come back with a mixture of clear CA glue and black CA glue to fill the void to try to prevent any wood staining. The second phase of the epoxy pour is just going to be clear epoxy. The black epoxy is cured at this point, so I'm going to need to sand it to create a mechanical bond. I would love to be able to pour clear epoxy right over the black epoxy to create a chemical bond, but my shop is far too dusty for that. Before we can add the clear epoxy, the client wanted us to add a Lone Star to this table. I went ahead and cut it out of black acrylic and glued it down. Let's go ahead and begin layer 2 of a 6-layered epoxy table. You might be asking a few questions at this point. 1, why does the epoxy look so gray? Well, those are air bubbles, and they go away. The second question you might be asking is why didn't you seal the wood before you just dumped all that epoxy on there? Like I said, my confidence level was at an all-time high, and I thought I'm too cool to fail. And like any fool, confidence is your friend at first. My thought was I'm going to do the pour early enough in the day that I can just go back and pop all the bubbles that show up. And that did happen, but I was up till 3 in the morning popping bubbles. I didn't record myself staying up all night trying to fix the air bubbles, but just making the situation terribly worse than it was already. Words the wife says to me whenever we work on a project, just let it be. The problem is, I'm not a just let it be type of person. The next morning, I can go ahead and see how all those hours I spent popping bubbles paid off. While sleeping, the wood continued to off-gas and created a bunch of bubbles that I could not pop.
Here, do you want to say anything about your failures here?
I'm a moron. Moron. To be fair though, all those little air bubbles here that came up were gonna be here regardless. So even if I didn't do all this stupidity here, that was gonna happen still. But then I could have fixed this easily.
You could have fixed that.
But those little air bubbles,
right
these
there.
micro bubbles, are because we didn't seal it. We should have sealed it first.
Yeah, well.
It's no problem. Get overconfident.
So I was hoping that I would only have to remove about 1/4 of an inch of epoxy to save this project. I definitely have like 1/8 of an inch left. I'm pretty sure that material, that thing's 1/4 of an inch, so this is definitely. So if I go one more down, maybe I can start sanding everything then afterwards.
At no point in your rambling were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought.
All right, what I'm trying to say is I need to pretty much remove all the epoxy and get it back to the wood surface and start over. So in the end, my overconfidence cost me about $200 worth of epoxy. Once I was back to mostly wood, I could go ahead and dig out some of the air bubbles that were still left in the surface. I brushed on a coat of epoxy to go ahead and seal the wood. And then I turned around and sanded right through that coat. Then added a new seal coat. Sanded that coat, but not through it this time. Cleaned the slab. Then fixed and cleaned the mold. Added caulking and screwed it all together again. Then I could go ahead and add the star back and wait 24 hours. Now I can mix up some more epoxy and do our last deep pour, but this won't be the last of the epoxy. From the sped up video, you can see that the left bottom corner is a low spot. So that means that I need to go ahead and flatten the top of the table again. Added pressure, that star re-glued down. I cannot afford to make another mistake. I don't have any more Spider-Man tears left to cry. My CNC got jammed multiple times due to my lack of good dust collection, but I didn't cut into the star. So we're gonna call that a win. The wood is exposed at the bottom of the table, so I made sure to do 3 coats of thick coat water-based poly. Now for some of you, this next step might just be the most important step of your life.
But for me, it was Tuesday.
I wouldn't say that I suck at finishing or that I'm very good at it, but what I would say is that it takes me at least 3 times to get it right.
Round 1.
I was hoping that I could be lazy and just use this spray can lacquer to finish the table.
This is a bad idea. Wow, that's not good. Why is it splattering out?
Wow.
Wow, that's not good. It literally just came and started spattering out.
Look at that.
You ready?
Well, you have to do it by sandstone.
Yeah, I don't know if I can get rid of that. This isn't working like I thought. Look at that. Again. Wow, this is like...
Nice close, right?
This isn't gonna work. I'm gonna try and let it dry and see what happens, but
Well, yeah.
not going on at all
Well,
smooth.
where did you stop? You stop right there.
It's definitely not working.
Okay. Just let it dry. We'll see how it comes out.
Okay. Definitely, right here, look. No, we're kind of in trouble. Yeah, we might have to do epoxy, which I don't want to do.
It was a complete failure. I could see sanding marks left in the surface, plus to add insult to injury, the cans left these little droplets all over the surface.
Round 2.
I decided that I'm just going to finish this table with a flood coat of epoxy. I tried to create a dust-free environment. Try being the key word. I don't know what you've been told, but almost is not good enough, especially when it comes to epoxy. There was a few contaminants left on the surface of the epoxy that I need to deal with.
Round 3.
I'm going to attempt to wet sand and polish this table. This will be my first time ever doing this. I kind of always knew that I was going to end up doing this, as the client wanted a high gloss finish, but I was also hoping that I could avoid doing this. And the final results came out looking terrible. So I went ahead and resanded at 240, 400, 800, wet sanded at 1200 and 2000 grit, but then pretty much got the same results. Tried to sand it by hand and that didn't go well at all. And I'm pretty sure I sanded some other time in between there. I kind of forgot because I started getting frustrated at this point. And once I polished everything up again, I noticed that there was these little spots everywhere because I unfortunately sanded through that flood coat I did earlier. So I needed to go back down grits to 800, nope, 80. And then I could sand back at 120, 180, 220, 320, 400, 600, 800. Then switch to a bowling ball sanders at 500, 1000, 2000, 3000, 4000. And the results were passable at best. Pretty disheartening, I won't lie, to work so long, put in so much effort and try your best and it still come out not as good as you wanted it. In the end, it all came down to using the wrong polisher and polish. I was using this polish because it was cheaper to try to save money. But in the end, I just ended up spending way more money doing it wrong. To actually finish this project right, I went ahead and bought some total bolt polish and a variable speed polisher. I guess sometimes it really is as simple as using the right tools for the right job. Now that the tabletop is ready, I can go ahead and make the legs. For the legs, I'm using ash as I plan on staining the legs later on. The design for these legs are pretty much all over the internet, so I'm not breaking any new ground here. But they are popular for a reason. They are simple to make, don't require a lot of material, and look good. Win, win, win. To assemble these legs, I'm going to take the easiest approach and just use pocket holes and glue. I thought about using dowels, but you won't be able to see the pocket holes in this project, and it was the fastest way to complete these legs as the next day I was going to the beach. And I wanted to make sure I get the table legs done before I left. I forgot to charge my drill batteries, so I pulled out my rusty trusty corded DeWalt drill. It's fine, nothing. Just bruised. After that, I waited for the drill batteries to charge. I stained the legs black with a Rubio Monaco stain. Then the next morning I could apply the finished Rubio Monaco in the color charcoal, which on camera just looks like I changed my shirt to do the same step twice. To attach the tabletop, I'm just going to use some pocket hole screws. I make sure to only screw where there's wood to avoid the epoxy. I drilled the holes in the legs oversized for any possible wood movement in the future. I honestly did not think I would ever finish this table, but I persevered and didn't quit, even though I definitely wanted to a few times. Remember those holes that the client had me drill? Well, they represent Dallas, San Antonio, and the hand-carved star, Austin. If you guessed that, great job. Sorry, but that's your only prize. One day I'll do a giveaway, and I promise you might just be able to win that prize. I really wish I would have started recording back when I first started making things. Throughout 2023, I built these desks, a kitchen nook table, a large computer gaming area, TV console, these things for our video game systems. I deprived you of so many awesome videos, and for that, I'm truly sorry. I have a lot of awesome things planned for the year 2024. I can't wait to share with you all the things that are inside my head.